Hi everybody, we're going to talk about notes from the 7th grade Common Core lesson 3.2. There's going to be two parts. The first part is going to be the first part is going to be adding and subtracting linear expressions, and then we're going to follow it up with factoring expressions. So, in the first part, when we go ahead and we're adding and subtracting linear expressions, a linear expression is an algebraic expression in which the exponent is 1. So in example 1, I have the quantity of 2x plus 2 plus the quantity of 4x minus 7. These parentheses, so the quantities, both have an exponent of 1, so they're considered linear. When I go ahead and do this, this is the same thing as combining like terms. So I simply just rewrite the two quantities without a parentheses because there's nothing in front of it to multiply. So I simply rewrite it 2x plus 2 plus 4x minus 7. Some of you are going to want to do it plus negative 7 so you don't mess your signs up. I'm now going to use the circle square method. Those are like terms, and those are like terms. 2x and 4x is 6x. 2 and negative 7, when I combine those terms, is negative 5. So plus negative 5, and in order to simplify it, 6x minus 5. So I'm adding this linear expression. 6x minus 5. In number 2, this example, I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the parentheses, but in order to do so, I have to use the distributive property to multiply 5 by every term inside the parentheses. So I'm simply going to rewrite 7w minus 6 plus 5 times negative 2.4. I don't know what negative 2.4 times 5 is, so I'm going to doodle it off to the side. 2.4 times 5, 20, 12, 120, 12. So I know that that is a positive times a negative, so that's negative 12y plus 5 times 1, which is 5. Now I have an expression in which I'm going to use my circle square method. Some of you are going to do that and change that minus 6 to a plus a negative 6. I have 7 w's and 12 negative w's. That means I have negative 5 w's. I have a negative 6 and a 5. 1 negative. So I simply rewrite it negative 5w minus 1. In my next example, I have a subtraction sign. This subtraction sign is really the same as adding a negative. So the first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is rather than negative 3x plus 7 minus the quantity 4x plus minus 8, I'm going to change it to negative 3x plus 7 plus distributed negative times the quantity 4x minus 8. So I literally rewrite that as negative 3x plus 7. I distribute the negative to each term. That's plus negative 4x. A negative and a negative is a positive. Plus 8. I now simplify like terms. Like terms. I add those like terms. Negative 3x's and negative 4x's is negative 7x's. 7 and 8 is 15. And there's no need to switch it because it's already simplified. In my last one, there's fractions that I have to distribute, and it's a subtraction problem. So I'm immediately going to rewrite this like this so I don't get confused by my negatives. I need to figure out half times w is 1 half w. 1 half times negative 6 is negative 3. Now in this one, I have to multiply negative 1/4 times w, which is negative 1/4 w. I need to multiply negative 1/4 times 12, which is negative 3. I then go back, my circle square. I have a half w that's positive and a negative 1/4 w. So that ends up combining for 1/4 w. Negative 3 and negative 3 plus negative 6, but that plus negative 6 isn't simplified yet, so I change it to 1/4 minus 6. So what you need to remember in this section is if the quantities are being added, you can just eliminate the parentheses and simplify by combining like terms. If there is a number in front of the parentheses, you have to use the distributive property. If it's subtracting, you still have to use the distributive property because subtracting is the same as adding a negative, and you distribute the negative. If it's subtracting with a number in front of the second parentheses, you change it to adding a negative, but then you have to distribute that negative coefficient. The next part of lesson 3.2 is factoring. I like to think of factoring as the reverse distributive property because factoring is writing an expression as a product of factors. So if I'm expected to go ahead and factor the coefficient, I need to identify the coefficient. It's 1/2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 1/2 out of each one of the terms. And then I need to figure out the reverse distributive property. 1/2 times what is 1/2 x? Well, 1/2 times x is 1/2 x. Some people here are going to go ahead and they want to write a 3, but 1/2 of 3 is not 6. 1/2 of what is 6? 12. After I factor the coefficient, I like to go back and see if I did the math correctly. So this ends up being my final answer, but in order to check it, I'm going to do 1/2 times x is 1/2 x, 1/2 of 12 is 6, and these should match. In the 6th example, I need to identify the coefficient as -4. I take the -4 out. I then need to ask myself, what times -4 is -4p? And then I need to ask myself, what times -4 is 12? This is where negatives get kind of tricky. A negative and a negative is a positive. So I need to multiply -4 by -3 to get 12. Now, as I'm factoring it, it doesn't talk about simplifying. So this or -4p minus 3 would be acceptable. Let's go ahead and do that so you can see that. Now, in example 7, I have to factor out a -1/5 because that's the coefficient. So I know I'm taking a -1/5 out. I now need to decide what times -1/5 is -1/5 x, and that ends up being x. Now this is the hard part because you got to work backwards with the fractions, or it's not necessarily hard, it's just a little more difficult. What times -1/5 is going to get me -4/5? 4. I'm going to do the same thing in both of these. I'm going to work backwards to check. -4 times p is -4p. -4 times -3 is +12. So I've done it correctly. So now they match. I'm going to do the same thing here just to make sure I've done the math correctly. -1/5 times x is -1/5 x. -1/5 times 4 is -4/5. If these match, I've gone ahead and factored correctly. Now, when we take notes, you may want to write everything down and then re-watch. Or you may want to watch and then write everything down. Or you may want to watch, pause, watch, pause, watch, pause. Bottom line is, you need to come in understanding this. If you have questions, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to respond to those. Thanks, guys. Have a good one.